Hello there, and welcome, Virtual Space Hero community, to another LinkedIn live show about hybrid work and modern work. And today we're going to look at the individual. In the past weeks, we have been looking very much and in depth at the organizational level. We were exploring how to navigate our organizations into a new hybrid work era. Today, I'm really interested and very much excited that one of the leading thought leaders is here with me on my stage talking about discipline for the modern worker, because it's not all about hybrid work. It is the modern worker that we should look at. The workplace is in flux. Everything is changing so often. And Scott Dawson is one of the experts in the field, and he had an interesting project in 2021 out of which 365, yes, 365 tips evolved that he published very successfully on Amazon. And here I'm happy to welcome and give space for Scott Dawson. Hi there, Scott.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Scott. It is a pleasure to have you on my stage, on my show. It is fantastic because when I found you on LinkedIn, I was so excited, and I definitely wanted to get to know more about those 365 tips that you have for routine management of the modern worker. But I would love to start first because I also know that you have been working remotely for 24 years. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that is a big number.
That is
Several
fantastic. How
decades.
did that start? How did that start?
It started as kind of an accident. So I was newly engaged in 1998, and my fiance and I had talked about where we wanted to live and start our respective careers, and we really didn't want to live in a big city. So I kind of went to my boss and had a candid conversation. About what my options were. I was looking at either internally transferring at my company. I had worked on site for 2 years, or was looking at other jobs outside of the company. And he said, well, wait a sec. You're doing a good job for us. We'd hate to lose you. So why don't you try telecommuting? And at the time, I'd never heard the term. So I never sought to work remotely. So he set it up as a trial, a 3-month trial, and said, if it continues to work out after 3 months, we'll just keep on going and see where it ends up. So I was remote at that company for 15 more years.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And honestly, kudos to your boss who had such an open mindset and who didn't let you go, but offered you different possibilities to stay in that role with him, but giving you the possibility to work remotely. That is, well, it's a genius.
It was
Fantastic.
very forward thinking, especially at that time.
Absolutely. And how did that evolve? So I assume that your company didn't have experience with remote workers or virtual workers at that point in time. How was it for you to becoming the first, like the pioneer of remote work in your organization?
Yeah, there was no certification and no kind of training. It was learn as I go. So we found a place to live in Massachusetts, and they set me up. At the time, it was an ISDN line, which was advertised as being twice as fast as dial-up. My company, they did have infrastructure for being able to remote in and access files and email securely. So that was really great. But a lot of the workflow things, we were really depending on the technology of the time. I'm a web designer and developer, so one story I love to share is being able to collaborate with somebody in that era over something that's inherently visual, because screen sharing really wasn't a thing either. I would do web designs and I'd upload them to a server, and my business counterpart, 4 hours away, they would look at their screen and print off the web page and mark it up with the changes they wanted to see. They'd fax it back to me, right? I'd pull it off my fax machine. I would make the changes, and that's how we collaborated over a very analog medium. So that was very interesting.
That's really fun to read. It's fantastic. And so many young people haven't even a clue what a fax machine did and how fast a fax machine indeed was. Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. If you think about the team itself, so you've been working for the company for 2 years, you were an integral part of the team. There were team dynamics and all the team things going on. How was it for you from an emotional perspective? And how did it work out? How were they they able to integrate and stay connected with you?
Yeah, I was pretty lucky because I knew all of the people that I worked with from having worked on site with them for such a long time. So I had
Mm,
developed those relationships. Um, so when I went away, it wasn't like full time away. I still came back to the quote mothership to visit, and I'd had business trips and, got to enjoy the in person periodically. But I also got to go back to my home office and really get into, flow, get into watching my kids grow up, being a great husband, and just really enjoying a relatively uh, less stress-filled life because I wasn't having a daily commute. Um,
mm,
and I think over the years, I've learned to develop and cultivate relationships that are mostly virtual or fully virtual.
mm.
Recent years, obviously, the pandemic exacerbated this, but I started and ended time on teams where I had never met anybody in person. So that's a really interesting dynamic, and I don't know. There's a lot of skills at play there.
But what you're also saying, and I think this is important, sometimes people underestimate and do not really talk about the importance of also meeting in real life. So you, in your case, you were for 2 years an integral part on site of that team, and you were already able to build up the relationships. But we know that even though it is possible, it is slightly more challenging to build up only virtual a relationship, also because we need to change mindset and think differently. So if you compare your first experience that you had having that possibility to be in presence and then go remote, and the previous or the after the experiences afterwards,
Right.
how were they? How did you onboard successfully to that new virtual team?
I think it's key to get to know people in as many dimensions as you can, because it's tempting to just show up, do work, and leave, right? But I like to get to know people I work with, work for, um, in a lot of different ways, and that looks like different things. When you're virtual though, it means you can have dedicated sessions where most of your conversation is casual and personal. And you're getting to ask them questions, they're getting to know you, right? I always like to start and end calls. We're all on meetings where we're waiting for somebody to arrive, a key person that might be late. Um, I always like to start that with not dead air,
Mm.
having conversations with some just point to point, and everyone else can jump in. But when you get to know somebody on a more personal level, it makes professional interactions a lot easier.
Absolutely. But Scott, I'm just thinking, I work on a global level. I've been involved very much with interculturalists, with a community of people who think about intercultural communication. And sometimes we also do face to work with cultures or people
Mhm.
who are just not as personal. And I do know that, for example, in Spain, people feel very comfortable if I start speaking about very private things, very early in our relationship, while maybe in a different context, more northern context, people would feel slightly more like hesitant to do so. What would you say on a global scale, on a global level? What would be strategies to still get to know those who don't like to share that much for whatever reason it is?
Yeah, and that can be tough. I can think of several examples where I've encountered people who just didn't want to talk about something personal, and that's okay. You're not going to be able to relate closely to everybody, and some people truly are just there to work and don't feel comfortable having their private life bleed into that. So I would say it's really important, especially as a manager, to read the room. You will ultimately get to know people better just by interacting with them, but you also have to be really good at knowing how how will your questions land, and if somebody's hesitant, just let that be.
Absolutely. And I think the one tool, strategy, or tactic, whatever you call it, that you already mentioned is this check-in. And I also feel like when I work with global teams, sometimes there is like the complaint, well, there are always some colleagues who come late, but well, they come late for whatever reason it is, but this time can be used while we are waiting for that relationship building. And I think this check-in should be always on the agenda, because very often we are so task-oriented, task-focused in our meetings. We jump directly into the first agenda point, and if the check-in is not there, well, we just don't do that. So I'd love that. I'd love to hear that, what you were mentioning.
Yeah, exactly.
Scott, you had an amazing project that you came up with in the year 2021, but you already wrote a book before in 2019 about also remote work. So accumulating your 24 years of experience that flew into that book of remote work in 2019, how did that go, the writing process, and what topics did you cover? What was very relevant for you to be in that book at that time?
The book was also interesting. Just like the start of my remote work journey, I didn't set out to write a book.
Another accident. You gotta be kidding me.
Another accident. So it came from an instant messaging conversation with a colleague of mine who was struggling with working remotely. He was a new dad, and he was chatting me and asking for tips because he was really having a hard time. So as I was sharing with him, he A, was grateful, and B, said, you've got to not keep this to yourself. You should do something with all of the stuff that you've learned. So I decided to write a book at that point. And I wrote every single morning for 6 months, every single weekday morning for 6 months for half an hour. We'll talk about discipline, I'm sure. And after the 6-month period, I had the book, so the rest of it was editing and marketing and doing all that fun stuff.
That is fantastic, because I was just talking to a friend of mine. She has been trying to carve out writing time in her daily routine for quite some time now, because she also is writing a book. And the last time I had a meeting with my business coach, and he was talking about the 48-hour book method. So I'm diving into that now, even though I don't think I write another book. I was for so many years in academia. It's fine with me writing books. But Scott, what I loved, and that's also how I discovered you on LinkedIn, you shared one tip every single day in 2021. And you shared that on LinkedIn, and then you wrote a book out of it. You published another book out of that. And that was all about today's topic: how can daily discipline help the modern worker, and beyond that, right? So what was your experience? What was the feedback from the people when you were sharing every day such a valuable tip for them?
Yeah, so I mean, the engagement was really fun, and it reminded me of a project. I take on kind of crazy projects from time to time. One is behind me. If you have the visual part of this as you're listening, I have a matrix of images behind me, and in a lot of calls, people are like, "What is your background?" It's not a virtual background. But if you got really up close, there are 366 drawings that I made. And so in 2016, which was a leap year, I just decided I wanted to hone my drawing skills. And every day I drew. It was kind of like an improv project. And the rules were simple. I couldn't censor myself. I couldn't start over. I used ink. So every day I drew something that was totally off the cuff. I tweeted about it with some kind of attempt at being humorous. And at the end of the year, I was like, this is really cool. I should do something with that, right? So I assembled them all into those poster boards, and they got hung in coffee shops and little galleries around town. People could come in and look at them. And 2016 was a pretty interesting year, and read all the quotes and stuff like that. And during the pandemic, those were just sitting in my closet because coffee shops were not open. So I hung them behind me. So I knew I could do something for a full year and keep it up. And during the pandemic, on the heels of writing, the art of working remotely is filled with anecdotes from my career and a lot of prescriptive advice, right? I wondered if I could actually write 365 unique tips for what I'm calling the modern worker. It's not just remote work, because we're all working in this modern workplace. It has changed so much over the last few decades. So as I posted those, it was great to engage with the audiences on Twitter and on LinkedIn. But also at the end of the year, it was really satisfying to put them together in handbook form.
I love that. It's really fantastic. And we're going to dive into that, and particularly about the routines that you were talking about and why routines are so important in a minute. And Yeah, it's really fantastic. I love the project and it's so fun. I just want to pick up on another thing because you were mentioning the modern worker. And I so much agree with you on that. And I need to blame a little bit myself because I also jumped onto the hybrid work and hybrid worker sort of slang or terminology. When I was a researcher, I was researching new ways of working. The terminology being used were new ways of working or new work, maybe modern work. So those were like the three terminologies that mainly were used in English in the English authors that I was following, and also in the German-speaking countries. And funny enough, now with all those things that happened in the past 2 years, everything switched to hybrid. And of course, to be findable, you need to sort of use a little bit the terminology of what your audience is searching for, right? But it's interesting what you're saying, and you're so right. I really love that. It's all about being a modern worker. It's about being more than just hybrid, whether working in the office or back home. It's about being modern also in the sense of how can you self-motivate, self-organize, self-lead, and all those things that have to do with oneself in a workplace that is totally in flux, as you're saying. Let us know a little bit about your thoughts on the modern worker. So you were already mentioning teams are changing, workplaces are changing. What else would you say is important to consider when we talk about the modern worker?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and I just want to comment on your comment about nomenclature. You know, when I used to moderate a community on Twitter for remote workers, and when I started it, I called it WFH chat, work from home chat, right? And about a year in, I realized that wasn't very inclusive because not everyone's working out of their house. So I changed it to remote chat. But again, that's not really very inclusive because it just signals a change in geography. You know, I'm not in a building with other people. I'm remote in some fashion. But what if everybody's remote? Then that's really not inclusive either. Um, so this modern worker has to deal with challenges that are born from not physically being with other people they're working with, but they have to concern themselves with being excellent communicators, being highly disciplined, being highly motivated, um, being highly organized. So all of those things kind of combine into what I'm terming the modern worker.
And I really like that. Thanks so much for sharing also your thoughts on that. But let's jump now into what you already mentioned. You apparently have a super self-discipline, right? And today we're talking about the daily discipline that can help the modern worker. So why is discipline so important?
Yeah, so when you're working in a shared space with other people, discipline it comes easier or can come easier because you have that inherent oversight. You know, is this person seeing me not working, or are they seeing me working? So when you're by yourself, if you are easily distracted or you tend to procrastinate, those are things that you need to identify and mitigate, right? Um, I can talk about the importance of having like consistent start and end hours for your day, for example. When we were all thrust into this whole remote work global experiment, some people had a tendency to overwork because they didn't have like those markers to bookend their day. So part of discipline is getting to work, but part of discipline is also stopping working, right? And having those guardrails in your day. I love startup and shutdown routines, you know, where a startup routine might be, I go for a walk before work. Like I walked my wife to her job at the school this morning. I
Oh,
came home,
lovely.
that was my cue. I step into my dedicated home office. That's a location cue that I'm in work mode, right? And at the end of the day, I have a shutdown routine. I have two laptops here. One is a work laptop, one is a personal laptop. And at the end of the day, I literally close my work laptop lid. I say goodbye verbally. And I put it in a cabinet on the side of my desk. And that actual physical swap of the technology is a really great cue to say, all right, it's time to put your work away and do what you need to do.
And Scott, honestly, those are so important things that you're mentioning. And as you have your dedicated home office, I'm also very privileged and thankful that I have my dedicated home office with all the things and the necessities, standing desk, and all the comfort that I just can think of. And that's also why for us, it might be even easier to get into the working mode, because what am I doing in my home office? Really only working. The point which you're mentioning, and I find it really interesting, is you were even using 2 laptops. So I'm just sharing a thought that I heard from a colleague of mine. She didn't have 2 laptops. She was using 1 laptop, but what she did is she was using different browsers on the laptop to separate between work and private, whatever she does on the computer. And I think this could be also a strategy for those who don't have their setup. But what you were saying is you were really literally saying goodbye. Love that. I've never heard that. Love it. And putting it away, because the moment that we have our computer in the living room where we are working at our dinner or lunch table whatsoever, sometimes it's really hard to switch off. And those who don't have the luxury really need to think even more about how can I really put everything away so that it's not in my sight, right?
Yeah.
To be in an off mode. Scott, so how do you create a remote work routine that works? Where would you start? You already said you're starting with the commute, walking your wife to the school, which I love. I also had coaching clients who did a walk around the block, simulating a commute so that they at least don't go with the pajama to the first meeting, and that worked for them. What would you suggest to start with?
So I think a routine starts with the place that you're working in. So look at your work style. Do you like energy around you, or do you prefer the quiet? So if I liked energy around me, I might seek to work part of the day out of a co-working space or a coffee shop. I love quiet. So I've created a space that dovetails nicely with how I like to work. It's a dedicated office with a door. And then from there, routine follows. You know, I took a cue from the other people I was working with. I work mostly with the same time zone, so I have very much a 9 to 5. But my advice is work in your window. You might find that you're a total morning person, right? And that's when you're most productive. You can do that. You know, you just have to let everybody that you're working with know that that's what you're doing and kind of get the buy-in for that. But there's no normal. You can work the time of day that you're most productive. And there was a New York Times article actually this week that talked about this non-traditional workday. You know, people are working perhaps 9 to 2, then taking a break to do something that they love, and then picking work back up after dinner, right? So this kind of split day into 2 or 3 chunks. If that works for you, and if it works for the other people that you're with, go for it. You're not stuck to this 9 to 5.
And I think these are super important tips, because very often we have in our mindset it needs to be 9 to 5, but very often, sometimes we are just not working well in the morning. And it's just also a private example with my husband. He is just not a morning person. He's not productive at all in the morning. He takes time. You cannot really speak to him. He is not super motivated. And after a year, our boy now is 14-month old. And what we do is usually he takes care of him in the mornings and I take care of him in the afternoons. Unfortunately, my schedule is sometimes crazy. So I have clients also in the afternoons, and we need a nanny, which we are very happy to have, a fantastic nanny that helps us. But I think just the switch from, okay, he doesn't need to work all day from 9 to 5, just because we think that should be. At the end now, he's only working part-time and he's as productive as before when he was working full-time.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
That's fantastic. It's really fantastic. And also the second thing that you were mentioning, same thing for him. He's a remote worker as I am, but I'm involved in so many teams and so many meetings that I not necessarily need to go out and see more people, talk to more people. I'm really happy as you are. Quiet room, door closed, my setup, nobody's here. And he felt that loneliness. And it also took him or us together like a year to understand that he needs to go at some point or sometimes to a co-working space. And also that it changed so much the dynamics for him and also between us, because he of course is much happier now that he is not only sort of socializing all the time with me and hearing me also speak all the time, because we're in the same home office, which can be a little bit annoying, but he has very good headset and he listens to very loud music. But anyways, also that changed a lot for us. And Scott, it's so much is what you were saying as well. Scott, Another question. How does, you were already mentioning, you are putting cues into your routine. So when you are starting, you have the cue to go into the office. You have another cue to maybe say good morning to your computer or goodbye. How does doing my work routine helps with remote work? What would you say?
Yeah. So without routine, you don't have any of the cues that it's time to get to work. If every day looks a little bit different for you, it can be really tough to get into a groove. So I usually start my days with some kind of fitness. You know, today it was a walk, tomorrow it might be a run. But if I didn't have that expectation that, hey, I'm doing something physical, then I'm going to go pour myself a second cup of coffee and sit down at my desk. I might not sit down at my desk until 10 or 11 when I'm like, oh, I really should be working, right? So if you do that repeated, you know, every day, you build a habit in essence. I'll talk a little bit about habit forming too. I used to use an app to do this, an app called Streaks, where you put in things that you want to make sure you do, right? But the thing is, once you do them long enough, you don't need the app, right? So my wife will laugh when I share this, but I'm a horrible flosser, you know, by trade. You know, I spent the first 30 years of my life not flossing and paying for it every 6 months. And I started to put it into the Streaks app that I would floss every day, and it would remind me. But after 6 months of using that, I didn't need the reminder anymore. And I was able to put in different things that I wanted to form habits around. So by creating those habits of things you do and places you go that are cues to start and end work, pretty soon you won't need to actually think about that. You know, I wash my face every night because I kind of made a commitment to do that. And I don't even need the app anymore. It's just something like, hey, I decided to do it. People around me know I'm focusing on it. I keep accountable. And you end up with a new habit.
And when did that happen? Also after 30 years. Sorry. And I love that as well. I just remember when I was like 10 years ago, I finally started stretching. I am so undisciplined when it comes to stretching, and I barely am able to touch the floor with my hands. It's like embarrassing. My mom can, I cannot. And by just having a reminder posted in my apartment in Vienna at that time, it helped me just to really build up that routine. But what you're saying about using also technology to support us in building up good habits, that's fantastic. And I know that Thomas, for example, my husband, he's using, I think it's a Google Chrome extension or something, where it's like, drink a sip of water, because we are both like horrible currently and not drinking enough water.
Right.
And also that brings back, even though it's like embarrassing that a computer needs to tell me when I need to drink water or that I should drink water, it helped us both to regain that habit of, as we know, it's very healthy to drink enough water throughout the day.
Right.
So I definitely love that. Thanks so much for sharing. And the app was called Streak, Streak.
S, plural. Yep. And I believe it's available for Apple. But I actually use another app too. You know, we're talking about the intersection of discipline and routine and all that. Some people might laugh because not everybody likes to vacuum and dust and clean their kitchens, right? But the tendency to want to do chores in your house, I mean, that can derail a remote worker. And it used to me, like I would look around and be like, oh, this needs doing, and this needs doing, and this needs doing. And well, my work needs doing too, right? And oh, by the way, in your home office, you're on the hook for cleaning your home office periodically. And so one of the hacks that I love is creating a chore chart for myself. And you know, you might loathe chores, but I would clean for half the day if I could. But by saying, hey, today this is the thing that needs doing and nothing else needs doing, you don't even have to think about it, because that something else will be next week or on the weekend. So I use Todoist along with, you know, managing my other to-do list, but I have a little chore project, and they just keep coming up, and that's totally fine. But it means that I'm not spending half of my morning doing things that are non-work related.
Totally good. Very good recommendation. And we just had a reel posted about apps that can support you in time management, and Todoist was on that. So thanks a lot for sharing this as well.
Fantastic.
Absolutely. Scott, you already mentioned and we already talked about balancing when you are working from the same place. Would you have also to, because I see time is running out, even though I have so many more questions, but we want to keep it to that 35 minutes. So
Sure.
if you think about balancing work and life, if it's happening in the same place, you already talked about cues and about saying goodbye. Is there anything else that can help us setting up those routines?
I got a master class in work-life balance the last 2 years because at times my wife, who's a teacher, was teaching remotely from the next room. My daughter, who's in college, was learning remotely from her room. And my son, who's in high school, was learning remotely from his room. And for all of us to coexist took a lot of very deliberate communication. So I got in the habit of letting others know when I needed to be heads down. The door is a fantastic signal. But if I had something like this where I really needed quiet, I would let them know I have something very important going on. Please don't bother me unless the house is burning down. Then I need to go. Uh, but as far as life happening, I hope that if you're listening to this, you're working in a place where those you work with understand and accommodate that. I've been really lucky throughout my career to have workplaces that understood that when things happen in life that work can get in the way of, that life comes first. You have to be there for your family. You have to be there for those who rely on you. And that, by the way, can be yourself. If you need to take care of yourself, if you need a mental health day, or if you have an appointment that you need to take care of, I think that's really important to make sure that there's space in your work life for those things to happen. And if there's not space, and if that's not normalized, that can really be a problem and be a real stress.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really important points. And I'm just thinking about how much I'm also, as you were saying, you were able to work from home and see your children grow up. That's also one of the things that I'm so happy about because, of course, well, I, as the mother, was at home with him when he did his first steps. But sometimes, also here in Spain, for example, mothers have to go back to work after 4 months. And for me, for example, with the remote work option, it was fantastic because I was here, the nanny was outside, Tomas was outside, and it was just such a nice way of being there all the time. And I really appreciate it. But it can be also something that you need to sort of handle if you're not able to completely switch off, because it can get noisy there in the living room, of course.
Exactly. You have to
Scott,
get comfortable with a certain amount of noise and a certain amount of distraction.
absolutely. Scott, it was fantastic talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing all your ideas on routines and discipline and why this is important. Everybody out there, don't forget to check out Scott's webpage, scottpdawson.com, and also connect with Scott on LinkedIn. Maybe there's another year upcoming where he's going to share a tip every day. Who knows? Otherwise, you can just check out all his previous posts, right, Scott?
Absolutely.
Scott, it was a tremendous pleasure having you. Thank you so much for being with us. And you know that I have a virtual cocktail prepared backstage, and I'm joining you in a bit.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. This has been great.
Virtual Space Hero community, thank you so much for also providing us with your ideas about routines for remote workers, for modern workers. We are continuing our journey, and I'll just need to announce that we have our guest lineup ready until, I won't believe it, I couldn't believe it either, until November this year. So almost all of them are on the webpage already, virtualspacehero.com 2022 LinkedIn Lives. If you want to head over there, check it out. Also on our podcast, the podcast is growing, and many of the previous episodes are already available for those who prefer listening and dive into the conversations while they are walking, running, or doing anything else on the road. And with that, I'm saying thank you very much for being with us, and I'm wishing you a wonderful morning, afternoon, or even good night. Bye.